And we are live with another edition of the All Gas No Break Sports Show. I am one of your co-hosts, Nicholas Pavon, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Andrew Johnson. As Johnson, now we are heading into the divisional round of this year's NFL postseason. We started with 14 teams. We are now down to the final 8 teams in this year's NFL postseason. And I won't sugarcoat it. It was a very rough wild card weekend for a lot of teams in the NFL this past weekend. Thankfully for us as viewers, we did have at least one good game this past wild card weekend, but a lot of the other games did end in blowout fashion. Teams now moving on to the divisional round, looking to get one step closer to a Lombardi trophy. And as we now know, we'll have the final 8 teams going into this upcoming weekend's action, trying to get to conference championship week next week.
So what qualifies as a good game? What qualifies as a bad game? Like I would venture to say that we had at least 2 decent games.
What was the second decent game?
Packers Eagles. That was a 1 touchdown game in the fourth quarter. Halfway through the fourth quarter, they had a realistic shot of winning that the entire game of the entire quarter.
I think we'll talk about that game in a little bit. I think for me, the reason why I didn't think that was a great game is because the Packers didn't play great for most of the
No, they played awful. They played awful, but it was still a close game.
It more came down to the Eagles were not taking advantage of what the Packers were doing, and they weren't scoring a lot. Like, they had a lot of bad play calling mistakes that gave the Packers chances, but the Packers just didn't capitalize on those opportunities. So I don't know necessarily. Like, I guess it was closer maybe than it seemed like, but I don't know. It just didn't. It wasn't a game that from start to finish I was locked into the entirety of the way. The Commanders and Buccaneers for me was obviously the only game that gave you that sense of feeling. The way that game started, the way that game ended, that was at least the best game we had the entire weekend. But for a lot of those teams that did win, they don't really care regardless of how they won those games. They're just happy to be moving on to the divisional round and now getting, as I mentioned, one step closer to winning a Super Bowl this upcoming season. So, Johnson, should we kick off our first recap of the wild card week?
Yeah, please get started.
All right, let's start off with the first matchup of the wild card weekend. That took place in Houston, Texas, between the Chargers and the Texans. Early on, it looked like the Chargers were going to control this game, had a 6-0 lead going into the second quarter. Texans' offense was really struggling. Meanwhile, their defense was playing phenomenal. Despite the offensive struggles, the defense held the Chargers to just those 6 points. And once the second quarter started, that's pretty much where the Texans took advantage of this entire game. They go on to beat the Chargers in this game 32-12. The offense finally got a little bit clicking towards the end of the first half. They then carried that over into the second half. But the story of this game, Johnson, was the Texans' defense. 4 interceptions forced on Justin Herbert. That was Herbert's most interceptions thrown all year. Going into this game, he had thrown just 3 interceptions the entirety of the regular season. He throws 4 in this one game alone. And the Chargers go from a team that everyone, including you and I, expected to win this game, maybe even convincingly, and moving on to the divisional round to now being a one-and-done team, and now having to go into the offseason trying to see what they can fix.
See, I wasn't entirely sold on the Chargers. If you listened to the podcast last week, I took Chargers money points because I thought they were going to win, but I wasn't really ready to count the Texans out.
Yeah, I was right with you.
It just seemed like it was the easy money, and at the end of the day, Justin Herbert just had a huge playoff meltdown. And for a lot of people, he is never going to escape those allegations, especially because during the playoffs, this is what tends to happen to him. If you take a look at the his playoff stats, albeit limited, right? He's had 2 playoff games in his career. Both have not been great. The first year had 1 touchdown, no picks, 85%. But the second half of that game, he kind of let it collapse against the Jaguars.
Well,
this year, it's 100. This year is 100% his fault. You can't even deny that. He threw 4 picks, just completely inexcusable.
Offensive line was really bad in this game as well for the Chargers, so they have a lot to go into the offseason. I mean, obviously, want to get another wide receiver for that team. They have a solid guy in Ladd McConkey. That's a good start. They need another, they could use a running game as well. Their running back room wasn't the greatest this season. They had J.K. Dobbins start off the year hot. Then he got hurt. Then he came back towards the end of the season, didn't really play as he was towards the beginning of the year. So they were like a consistent running game. But I think the good thing for Houston is that they at least get some momentum now going into their next matchup, which we'll preview in the mushing hour in our next part of the show. But a very good showing for this team. Stroud looked better in the second half after a slow start to the first half. Joe Mixon had himself a nice performance as well as Nico Collins. And their offense looked a lot better than the offense we saw going into the wild card because we talked about it going into this preview of the show last week. And this also includes the game that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. Momentum has been a key for a lot of these teams going into the postseason. And if you looked at these two teams, the Chargers had all the momentum going towards them. The Texans, not so much. And the script just got flipped for those two teams, and the Texans move on. But Johnson, as I mentioned, we made that same similar case for the next matchup that we had on Saturday, and that was between the Steelers and the Ravens. And this game pretty much went expected the way that you and I, when we previewed it now. The Ravens have all the momentum going on. The Steelers have been on a downward spiral since they started the year 10-3, and it showed in this game, especially in that first half. Derrick Henry, 186 yards rushing in this game. Solid performance as well from Lamar Jackson. As always, the defense for the Ravens had themselves a good first half. The second half was a little bit sloppier, but the Steelers just put them, pretty much just shot themselves in the foot for the majority of this game. For the majority of the second half of the season, Baltimore wins 28-14. They move on now to the divisional round of the postseason. And now, Johnson, for the Steelers, this is their sixth straight postseason loss in the last couple of seasons. And this one really seems as if it could be the turning of really bad things to come for this team because you now are hearing all this talk about turmoil within the locker room. Has Mike Tomlin lost the team entirely? And, there's guys that are going to the offseason. You have a very interesting offseason coming up because both of your starting quarterbacks are now no longer on the team because of expiring contracts. TJ Watt's got an expiring deal coming up soon. So the identity of this team right now could be a lot more different in the next year or two for this one.
Yeah, I mean, Doc Rivers, excuse me, Mike Tomlin,
No.
hasn't led this team to a playoff victory since 2016. I think he made the AFC Championship game that year against the Patriots, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe so.
Yeah. Uh, Came in early in his coaching career in Pittsburgh, won a Super Bowl his second year, went back to the Super Bowl a couple of years later, couldn't capitalize on that, and he just hasn't been back to it since. Like you said, there's been a lot of talks about the downfall of this team if they're going to blow it up. There's been jokes saying the Mike Tomlin special since the last 6-7 years is, oh yeah, 1 or 2 games above 500. Of course, there's been exceptions to that rule where he goes 10-7 now for the last year or two. He went 9-8. He went 12-4. But the Mike Tomlin special has been at 500 or a game above 500 for the better part of a decade now. So something's got to give here at this organization. I don't know exactly what they're going to do. I would say maybe do a retooling. Because I said from the beginning that Russ wasn't going to lead this team to any deep into playoffs. I said, yeah, he might win you a couple games here and there, but he's evidently he's cooked, and his run game didn't help him either. Najee Harris couldn't even muster up 30 yards. It was just a disaster all around. Baltimore really controlled this game, and now another playoff. I don't want to say choker, but a guy that has doubts casted around him in Lamar Jackson is going to face another guy that has doubts shrouded around him in Josh Allen in this next playoff game.
Yeah, I mean, for those two guys, it's obviously simple. Win that game, and then
You beat the allegations.
and you have a chance to beat the allegations. But remember, they might have to potentially play Patrick Mahomes once again. So that's really the big litmus test for one of those two guys trying to beat Mahomes. Because unfortunately for those two guys, they have not been able to do that in the postseason yet. So for those two guys, we'll see what
And
happens.
what I will say is, at least when Josh Allen played Mahomes, it was not his fault. As much as I don't want to give the Bills credit, Josh Allen's when he played Mahomes, not his fault. Lamar Jackson, you could say it's the play call, you could say it's him. But the good thing is now that he's such an excellent passer, uh, maybe if they decide not to run the ball in the second half, if they do play the Chiefs, it
Wow.
won't matter as much. But that's
You have no
Neither here
excuse
nor
right
there.
there. When you have Derrick Henry running for 186 yards in a playoff game that happened this past week, I mean, there's really no excuse for you not to use him to your fullest extent, especially if you're playing this Bills team who Derrick Henry had a big game earlier on in the season against, and if you get to the AFC Championship game and you do in fact play the Chiefs, I mean, listen, the Texans don't count them out just yet. Maybe they can shock us all after what they did this past weekend, but the goal for Buffalo and Baltimore is just being the boogeyman. If it is in fact going to be the Chiefs, and if it's not the Chiefs, then you have a chance against a Houston Texans team that a lot of people would be. They're not as fully strengthened as they were going into the season, but they're still a very formidable opponent, especially after what they just did to the Chargers this past Saturday. But as I mentioned for the Steelers, yeah, a very long offseason coming up for them. Who's going to be the quarterback of this team? Um, I'm hearing like guys like Rodgers and Kirk Cousins, which is already, if you're a Steelers fan, I'm already looking towards the year after because
Discommit to Justin Fields. That's all I got to say. Give
I,
him a
I
fair
haven't been
chance. You pulled him after one loss, and he was playing great. He was learning to make those deep passes. His run game was good. He's a young quarterback. I think they completely dropped the ball on him.
I mean, like I said, they started 10-3. We were even, a lot of people talk about them potentially getting the number one seed in the AFC. Then they lose that game to the Browns on that snowy Thursday night in Cleveland, and the whole season went downhill right after that. So yeah, they're in for a very long offseason. I don't know exactly what the direction of this team is. George Pickens, people seem to be running him out of town now at this point as well, because they might be seeing another Antonio Brown in their instance. So I don't know. I don't know. They have a very long offseason, as I mentioned, coming up. And this loss, especially to a division rival, does not help whatsoever for this Pittsburgh Steelers team. Now,
Justin
as you
Fields,
mentioned,
by the way, limited sample size and attempts, but he averaged more yards per carry than Jalen Warren and Najee Harris.
he's going to be an interesting commodity for the free agency because there's going to be a couple teams like
I would
Vegas,
definitely take a flyer on him. That's a
maybe
no brainer. It's not like it's
maybe the
another guy.
Jets.
Let's say like Zach Wilson. Like Justin Fields he's still a proven. He's not a proven quarterback, but he has a lot of upside.
Well, the thing is, for the teams that can't draft a quarterback in, let's say, the top five or whatever, like as I mentioned, the Raiders and the Jets. There's a couple other teams that I'm completely blanking off the top of my head. Saints as well, like teams like that could use a quarterback because they're not going to be able to get like a Shador Sanders or Cam Ward potentially. Maybe even the Giants because they could be in the same boat as well at pick 3. But those are teams that you're going to look at Justin Fields and even a Sam Darnold, who we'll talk about in a little bit as well. That if we can't get a quarterback in the draft, those are the top two guys right now going into free agency in terms of quarterback play that you might want to look at trying to bolster your team next season and get into the playoffs as a potential wild card or even division winner. Who knows? So now moving on to our next game, and we kind of alluded to Josh Allen just a little bit when we talked about Baltimore. Let's talk about that Buffalo Bills game with the Denver Broncos. Early on in the game, Johnson, we saw Denver score the opening points of this game with Troy Franklin getting the 43-yard touchdown reception from Bo Nix to put the Broncos up 7-0. And after that, Buffalo would get the football. They answered with a just field goal. So Denver had to lead 7-3 going into the second quarter. But it was just all Buffalo Bills from most of this entire game. You look at the time of possession as well as the yardage in this game, and the Bills controlled every aspect of it whatsoever. 120 yards rushing for James Cook. Josh Allen throws just 6 incompletions on the game as well. 2 passing touchdowns, including that thrilling touchdown pass to Ty Johnson on 4th down in the back of the end zone. Bills score the next 31 points of this game against the Broncos and win 31-7. And as you alluded to, they will get that matchup with Lamar Jackson and company next week in the divisional round for a trip to go to the AFC Championship game. Could be a potential home playoff game for those two teams if the Texans go on to beat the Kansas City Chiefs in the divisional round. And we'll now see, Johnson, as you mentioned, for one of those two quarterbacks, they'll be able to get another playoff victory and maybe get a chance to beat Patrick Mahomes and company in the AFC Championship game if it is indeed going to be the Chiefs in that AFC title game. But nonetheless, it's a huge game for both Lamar and Josh Allen, considering that those are the two favorites right now for the MVP award.
Yeah, it's going to be one hell of a matchup between those two. But I guess let's talk about the Bills game. Do you think the Buffalo fans were sweating just even for 2 or 3 minutes when Denver came hot out of the gate and they scored that immediate touchdown, and then for the rest of the game, they did absolutely nothing. Like I got a feeling for at least the first 15 minutes of that game, they felt a little nervous.
I would say maybe the first five. I would say the first 10 minutes. Once Buffalo got held to a field goal, because the Bills got down the field and they got themselves into position to tie the game, but got held to three, which kept them within four. So I think at that point you're thinking, okay, listen, if our defense gets a stop here, which they did eventually do, because the Broncos did have a fake punt on the next ensuing drive. They did get held to nothing on that drive regardless, so the fake punt didn't really mean as much. But once they got that stop defensively, I think you saw the confidence kind of build back towards Buffalo and entirety of fans as well. Their offense was clicking on all cylinders. Their defense was playing phenomenal. And you gotta give, you gotta give Bo Nix Company credit. Like they did as much as they possibly could in this game to try to compete, but they're just not there yet with this roster. I mean, we expect a lot of people expected this team to be a potential team picking in the top five this upcoming season, and they were the last wild card team in the playoffs. And for about 15 minutes, at least the first quarter, they were playing back and forth with Buffalo. But once the second quarter pretty much kicked off, that's where Buffalo really took advantage of this game and kind of ran away with it. And they showed why that they're one of the favorites, not only for the AFC, but to win the Super Bowl entirely. But as we mentioned, they have to get past Lamar Jackson first, and then either a matchup with CJ Stroud or Patrick Mahomes in the conference championship game to get to the Super Bowl, which would be their first Super Bowl in a long time.
When's the last time they've been to the Super Bowls? 25 years?
What was the last?
1999?
I'm trying to think. What was the last year of the Bills four?
It was with obviously Jim Kelly, right?
Yeah, but I don't think it was 99. I think it was earlier than that. 94. 94 was the last one.
Jeez, over. I was gonna give him 25, but 31 years. That's a while.
Yeah, I mean, listen, they have been itching and clawing to try to get them back into this spot. The closest, obviously, was a couple years ago against the Chiefs, but you know, I think for them, they know what's coming up ahead of them because you can't look past Baltimore because obviously we saw what happened against when these two teams played in the regular season. Baltimore just flat out dominated them in that game. The offense for the Bills looked slow. Derrick Henry looked like a monster in that game. Lamar Jackson did his thing, and that was probably the Bills' worst. If you ask any Bills fan what the worst game this was the entirety of the season, it was that game against Baltimore on Sunday Night Football earlier in the season. So they have a chance to redeem themselves from that game, but it's going to be very tough. This is a very, very good Baltimore Ravens team, and it's by far the game of the week coming up for the divisional round. This is the game that everyone is going to be tuning into to see who gets to the AFC Championship game to take on either Kansas City or Houston for that game. Any final thoughts before we move on to the NFC side of this postseason wild card?
Yeah, nothing really on the game, but just that the entirety of the Bills Super Bowl run, they just spent. You guys just started. You guys, what I mean by you guys is the NFC East just took turns beating up on the Bills, which I think is the funniest part about all of this. It was what they lost to the Giants, the Redskins, and the Cowboys twice, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so just the NFC East just took turns, just beating the hell out of the Bills for 4 years.
And obviously, the best chance was that Giants game, but they know what happened in that game. They know exactly what happened in that game. So we'll see. But as you mentioned, the NFC East, let's go to one of those NFC East teams that made the postseason this year, Johnson. And it's, of course, the number 2 seed in the NFC, that being the Philadelphia Eagles. They took on the Green Bay Packers this past weekend in the first round of the NFC Wild Card playoff. And as I mentioned earlier, it looked like, for pretty much 3 quarters of this game, it was, going into the fourth quarter, it was 16-3 Eagles. But it felt like it was way bigger the way this game was going between these two teams. The Packers fumbled the opening kickoff. Eagles score an ensuing touchdown off of that turnover. They would only get 3 more points the rest of the way in that first quarter. It was 10-0 Philly going into halftime. But the Packers just made so many mistakes in this game. Jordan Love had 3 interceptions for the entirety of the game. I mentioned that fumble as well on the kickoff. On the Packers, to their credit, they made this a game in the fourth quarter. We saw a big run from Josh Jacobs towards the end of the third quarter to set them up for the touchdown in the start of the fourth quarter that put them within 6 So it gave them some kind of life, but it really just didn't make a difference, unfortunately, for Green Bay the rest of the way. The Eagles were able to attack for two more field goals in the fourth quarter. The Packers, as I mentioned, those turnovers really came back to haunt them as this game went along. And the Eagles, they move on to the NFC Divisional Playoff round with a 22-10 victory over Green Bay. So last year, Johnson, we saw the Packers as a 7 seed beat the number 2 seed, which at that time was another NFC East opponent. This time, it was not meant to be. They are now one and done, and now Philly moves on to host a playoff game next week, trying to get to the NFC Championship game.
Yeah, we kind of recapped this game earlier. I don't think I have much to say on this, so I think unless you have anything to say, we can go into our next game here.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd say is Packers. I mean, they lose this game, but they still have I'd say, a bright future just because their roster is still pretty good on paper. It's just going
They have
to
a year or two before they start to get worried.
Yeah, I think the biggest concern for them is they need a pass rusher because that was the biggest problem for them in this game. They really didn't they couldn't really attack the quarterback, and that was a problem for them the entirety of the season. So if they get a pass rusher at some point, that might help. But I think if you're a Philly fan, I think you're happy you won. I think you might start to worry if your offense plays like the way they played for the majority of that second half. If they play like that again, they're not going to be as lucky as they did to win this game because they're going to be facing
Absolutely
some
not.
top tier
They can't tempt
offenses.
fate twice.
Yeah, I mean the biggest thing for the Eagles because if this was last season's Eagles team where their defense played horribly in the second half of the season, the Eagles lose this game. But to their credit, Vic Fangio in his first year with the team as the defensive coordinator has done a phenomenal job in retooling and fixing this defense that played really bad that second half of the season last season. And they're a huge reason why they won this game against the Packers, forcing those amount of turnovers on Jordan Love and company. So that was unfortunate for Green Bay, a one and done scenario for them, and it led one of the NFC East teams to moving on to the divisional round. But they were not the only NFC East team, Johnson, to move on to the divisional round. How about the scrappy Washington Commanders getting a 23-20 win on a doink field goal that almost, for some fans, you see a doink and you expect a miss off a field goal attempt, but for the Commanders, it just seemed as if fate was on their side with this doink. Zane Gonzalez gets the kick at the end to help the Commanders win their first playoff game since 2005. And funny enough, Johnson, that was also against Tampa Bay Buccaneers that season. They go on to win 23-20. They will now move on to the divisional round, and they got a very daunting task in the divisional round, taking on the number 1 seeded Detroit Lions. But I think the biggest story of this game, and it's been the biggest story of the entirety of the season for this Commanders team, Johnson, J.D. Daniels looked phenomenal in this matchup, and huge reason why they are able to come out with this victory and move on to the playoffs.
Yeah, some would say he is the same fantasy value as Jared Goff. But that's just some people that don't know ball. Anyways, uh, he played a phenomenal game. He is really the key reason why they won this game. Zane Gonzalez, really nervous. If you saw, he took his helmet off and on multiple times,
Got OCD.
walking up to that final. Yeah, walking up to that final kick. He wanted to make sure everything was fine. And if you're the Buccaneers now, where do you go from here? You keep Baker and Mike Evans, but Godwin's probably going to walk in free agency.
Yeah, that's
Defense and the rest of the offense is getting a little bit older. So where do you go here? Do you go for a retool? Do you do a full rebuild? What do you do?
I still think you go for it. I think you can't. I don't think you're necessarily in the spot to rebuild because Baker. I don't want to say he's older, like old, but
He's
like
not.
he's
He's
getting
fine.
like he no, he's fine. But I'm saying Mike Evans is getting up there in age. Baker's gonna
He'll be 32 next season.
Right, but I'm saying they're getting up there in their start of
Yes.
the ages where, like, eventually, once their current contract deals expire, then that's where you probably start thinking about maybe a retooling and a rebuild. I think at this point, because of how bad your division is, you're probably still just going to be good enough to win the division as a whole. So you're probably still going to be a playoff team. I think you should just keep, rebuilding and, you know, make sure that this roster is still good enough for next season. If you can get Godwin back, that's a huge plus. I don't know if necessarily that's going to happen because I'm going to assume. I mean, it is going to be a tough market for him coming off an injury, but he will get paid by any team needing a wide receiver. Um, I think the biggest thing they need to look forward to is maybe getting a little bit more offensive line help, I think that would definitely help them in a sense. And I think if they aren't able to bring back Godwin, they're going to need a number 2 wide receiver because they didn't really have that for the majority of the second half of the season, and they were able to get away with it despite that fact. So I don't think they necessarily have to rebuild just yet, but maybe in like 2 to 3 years, you could start maybe potentially seeing that, depending on how their roster looks like for them in the next couple of years. So I think only time's going to tell for that team. Any
Yeah, I
final
think that's
thoughts
gonna.
on that game?
No, I think it's gonna bring us into our final game where we saw the Rams absolutely dominate the Vikings. They advanced to the divisional round. Sam Donald has a lot of question marks. Is JJ McCarthy gonna start? What's Kevin O'Connell gonna do? Nick, break it down for us.
Uh, yeah, this was another stinker. Unfortunately, when you saw, obviously remember the impact of what happened in this game with the wildfires going on in Los Angeles. This game got moved to Arizona, so already a lot of weighing impact on the Rams going into this game. It's a playoff game for one, and then obviously you're thinking about your community as a whole. And the Rams just dominated this game on both sides of the ball. I mean, Matt Stafford looked like prime Matt Stafford in Detroit. Kyron Williams and company, Puka Nakua were all making big plays. Tyler Higbee even was making some big plays in the first half for them. And their defense just was the biggest story of this game. I mean, whether you want to pinpoint it on the Vikings offensive line being bad, Sam Darnold holding the ball for too long and just being bad, everything that could have went wrong for the Vikings in this game went wrong for them in this game. Rams win 27-9. They forced 9 sacks on Sam Darnold in this one, a couple of fumbles as well, some turnovers as well for Darnold. But really just a backbreaker for him. And what most likely, in my opinion, will be his final game as a Viking. Um, I do expect them to go to JJ McCarthy next season. I think that was going to happen, even if they were to have won this game. Because Darnold's gonna command money in the offseason, whether even before this game happened, he was gonna get around 30 plus mil, and I think the Vikings, I think they want to see what they have in McCarthy because you remember you traded up to get him in the draft, and you're also looking at it like he's a top 10 pick. You're already paying him top 10 pick money. You probably should see what you have him in first, and Darnold's going to get 30, 35 mil probably from a team that is going to miss out on a quarterback come NFL draft time. So a team like, as I mentioned earlier, maybe the Raiders, maybe it'd be funny, but maybe even the Jets maybe bring him back. You could look at, I hate to say it, but I can see the Giants maybe try to make a play for him because we don't know what their situation is at quarterback in terms of getting one in the draft. It's the same thing as the Justin Fields argument that I made earlier, where those teams that are going to miss out on quarterback are going to look at Sam Darnold and say, well, you know what? Maybe we take a flyer on him for a 2 to 3 year deal, like kind of what the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are doing with Baker. Give him a 2-3 year contract, let him play out the contract and see how you do, and go from there. I think the problem for the Vikings is that for Kevin O'Connell, he's going into his final year of his contract this upcoming 2025 season. So he's kind of playing for his job, I guess, at this point. I don't necessarily think he deserves to get fired because I think he's done a phenomenal job with the Vikings. I mean, let's face facts. You and I, and probably most of the entire NFL world did not expect the Vikings to win 14 games this season, especially with Darnold being the starting quarterback of this team. Even if it was McCarthy, you were not
No,
expecting a
most of us had
14
them.
season.
Most of us had them pegged below the Packers. They had them as the third seed, at least not the third seed overall, but the third seed coming out of that division.
I think you could have saw
People
them
could
maybe
have the
sneaking
argument
in.
that
Yeah, go ahead.
you could have argued the Bears, but you would be a crazy person to argue that. But yeah, you got to argue they were going to sneak in, like kind of like the Packers. You expected the Vikings to be where the Packers are, and you expected the Packers to be where the Vikings
Right.
are.
You could
And
have
if you
easily
swap
made
those two,
Right. You could have easily made the argument that if you flip those two teams' records, that's where you could have seen that happen. The Packers being a 14-win team, the Vikings being a 10-win team that just sneaks into the playoffs. I could have agreed. I could have seen that argument, but it was flipped, and the Vikings. It just whatever was it was weird because remember the week prior they were playing for the number 1 seed in the playoffs in the NFC. They got beat down in that game, and they got beat down in this game as well. And credit to the Rams because they had the Vikings number both times this season. The Vikings, think about this, Johnson. They lost 4 games this season, and they lost 4, and it was to 2 opponents. They lost to the Vikings. I'm sorry, to the Lions and the Rams in back-to-back weeks, and it happened again in this one. They lose to the Lions to end the regular season, and then they lose to the Rams in the postseason. So that was their 4 losses the entirety of the season. And the Rams now, they move on to Philadelphia, and they'll take on the Philadelphia Eagles in the divisional round.
Yeah, it's going to be one hell of a game. And before we go into the mushing hour, let's talk about Mike McCarthy out as the Cowboys head coach. They couldn't agree to a contract extension. Now that leads a bunch of possibilities to be happening in Dallas. Funny answers include Bill Belichick's. More realistic answers include a Deion Sanders. Uh, any idea who goes there, Nick?
I'm not certain because remember the rule you have to make for some of these head coaching hires. So last week, some of the teams that were trying to hire a guy like Ben Johnson or Aaron Glenn, they had the opportunity to interview them because the Lions were on a bye week. But now, because the Lions are preparing for a game this week, the Cowboys can't even interview one of those 2 guys. So they cannot interview any of the coordinators until after the Super Bowl. So they're probably going to be hired by that point, if they don't get hired by then. So for me, I don't even know if Dion necessarily is realistic because yes, they have talked about it, but from what Dion has said to reporters, and this could just be all smoke, but it sounds like he just wants to go back to Colorado this upcoming season. So I don't even know where you go if you're Dallas. If you want my true answer, I think I can tell you who might be the coach next year. I think I
Please
have an
tell me.
idea. I think it's gonna be Kellen Moore. I think it's gonna be Kellen Moore. He left them in the off.
Okay.
He left them in the offseason to go to be the Eagles offensive coordinator. We obviously saw what they did this past season in terms of offensive numbers. And he obviously has familiarity with the entire organization and the players that are currently slated on that team. I mean, look exactly what Dak did last year in terms of passing numbers with Kellen Moore as the offensive coordinator. He had an MVP type season last year. You bring back him, with Dak coming off an injury. CeeDee Lamb had a phenomenal season last year. I could very much well see it because from what if you talk to Jerry Jones about Kellen Moore, he's enamored with him. He loves the guy. He's a Texas native. I feel like it just makes if they're not able to get a guy like Dion, which I don't think is going to happen, and they're definitely not getting Belichick either. I think Belichick's committed to the North Carolina gig, but maybe I could be wrong about that too. I think Kellen Moore might be more of the realistic hire that could happen for Dallas. So that's a name I would watch for them to hire.
All right. So I like the pick. So I think with that being said, we can go straight into our mushing hour now.
Yes.
And if you want, Nick, I'll start breaking the games down. First game we have up here, we have the Houston Texans going on the road, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs. Chiefs at home, they are a 7.5 point favorite, and the over-under slated at 41.5. Chiefs minus 7.5 here. This is an easy one. They're going to dominate this game. I don't have any faith in Houston. They're lucky to be here. Take a bow, but Chiefs are going to dominate this one, especially coming off the bye.
Patrick Mahomes just had another child, so it could be dad strength added to this game for him going into this one. I think the Texans, phenomenal win against the Chargers. I mentioned a lot of people thought, including guys like, they even mentioned it in the post-game talk. Rex Ryan was literally going on air saying that was a bye week for the Chargers, and the Texans just stomped them in that game. So credit to them for getting to this point. I'm going to go with the Chiefs minus 7.5 as well. I just think, we saw what happened the last time these two teams played. It was a little bit closer than a lot of people expected, but that's been the Chiefs this entirety of the season. They've been playing a lot closer games than we have expected them to play this entirety of the season. But I just think they get it done. I think they host the AFC Championship game in Arrowhead the week after, and they'll face either Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen in that matchup, which we'll preview in just a little bit of time. Now, the other game that we have on Saturday night, Johnson, and this could be a very interesting game down in Detroit between the Washington Commanders and the Detroit Lions. The Lions are at home a 10-point favorite for this game. The over under is 55.5 for that game. So a lot of people in Vegas are considering the Lions to be a heavy favorite in this game. Do you agree with that sentiment, or do you think
I
Washington
don't
can
agree
keep it
with it.
close?
I think Washington definitely keeps within 10 points. Give me Commanders plus 10. The Lions are going to win this game, but Commanders plus 10 is an insanely disrespectful line, especially for a coach like Dan Campbell that likes to go for it on fourth down a lot. He's not even the best coach to do it or the best team to do it, excuse me. It's the Commanders. They're the best fourth down team. So you may see Dan Campbell get a little bit of his own medicine here, and it could backfire on him.
It's something about those Dans, because Dan Quinn was doing that, as you mentioned, in that game against the Buccaneers. And, you know, sometimes it didn't pay off, sometimes it did. So I think that's an interesting scenario going into this game for these two teams. I think the Commanders can keep it close. Also, I don't want to keep agreeing with you, but I'm going to go with the Commanders plus 10. And I haven't been doing great in the over unders this season. I'll just keep the Commanders plus 10. I want to talk myself into the over. 55.5 is a lot of points for a playoff game, so I'm just going to talk myself into to plus 10 for now. Maybe come back to me in a little bit if I want to reconsider that one. What's the first game we have on Sunday?
We're going to have the LA Rams going into the Philadelphia to take on the Eagles. The Eagles are at home. They are a 6.5 point favorite, over under slated at 43.5. Give me Rams plus 6.5 here. The Eagles didn't look so great against Green Bay, and I think the Rams are a way better team than Green Bay. So give me Rams plus 6.5. I think they keep it close.
Yeah, this has the potential to be a trap game for the Eagles, because I think everyone's and a lot of people I think are expecting the Eagles to win this one handily. The Rams just have a lot of guys on both sides of the ball that will keep this game, in my opinion, closer than people expect. Because you have, Jared Verse, their phenomenal rookie on the defensive unit, has been great for them this season. Obviously, look at their offense. Kyron Williams is a beast. Puka Nacua is a beast. Cooper Kupp hasn't done as much most of the season. Also was hurt for a majority of it. But even since he came back from injury, he hasn't really played a huge factor for the Rams. I feel like they're going to need him to play some sort of a factor in this game if they want to pull off this upset. Um, to ensure that they don't get fully mushed, Johnson, I'm just gonna go with the Eagles minus 6.5. Hopefully, I mush them to the point where they lose, and I don't have to worry about them winning a potential Super Bowl. So, give me Eagles minus 6.5. But I do hope the Rams win that game on Sunday afternoon. Now, as we mentioned, the game of the week by far this week is going to happen in Buffalo this upcoming weekend. It's Baltimore at the Bills. The Ravens go into this game as a road favorite, a 1 point favorite. So pretty much a pick 'em between these two teams, Johnson. The over-under at 51.5. Who do you have winning this game?
Baltimore Ravens -1. They're going to win the game, and obviously they're going to cover because, let's face it, you need to win by more than half a point here. So give
Yeah,
me Ravens -1.
it's a pick.
Uh,
It's a
it's
pick
a
'em.
pick 'em. It's a pick 'em. It's a true pick 'em. Ravens -1. They get it done here. Buffalo will sink into the sea of sadness once again and talk about next season.
I'm just gonna take Bills plus 1. I'm just gonna do it. I think you know we saw what happened the first time these two teams played. I mentioned it was a really bad game for Buffalo, their worst game of the season. The biggest thing for the Bills going into this game is they have to stop the run, and that's without saying. I mean, you obviously have to deal one with Lamar Jackson and his running ability, but now you have to deal with Derrick Henry, and we saw what happened the first time. Derrick Henry had a monster game for Baltimore, and that went over the Bills. If they're able to contain Derrick Henry, that will give them a chance. I think Baltimore would also love to have a guy like Zay Flowers play in this game, because he did not play in that game against the Steelers. They are saying he's more than likely going to play in this upcoming game. So that's a good sign for the Ravens going into this one. They definitely could use him. But it's going to be a cold one. It's going to be a very cold game in Buffalo this upcoming weekend. Um, I'm very much looking forward to this game. For my Bills fans that, listen to this podcast, I'm praying for you this week. I'm hoping that Buffalo can get the job done, because let's face fast, I want to see another Chiefs Bills game. It's provided such good entertainment for the last, what is it now, 5, 6 plus years. I want to see the next chapter get right into that story and see maybe
I
Buffalo get.
do you
Go
want to
ahead.
predict? Do you want a spoiler, not a prediction of that story?
I think I know where you're going to go with it, but go ahead.
Chiefs win in a close game that the Bills can't do anything about, and there's a rule change next season to prevent that, and then the Chiefs win again the next meetup.
Does that So in your scenario with Baltimore, are you expecting the same thing?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, I think for you and I think no matter who wins this game, we just want them to beat the Chiefs probably the week after. I know for you especially, you want them to beat the Chiefs. I necessarily don't have a beef with the Chiefs, but I would like to see a different change in the Super Bowl. So if it is the Texans, hopefully maybe they can pull off the upset. But if it's either Baltimore or Buffalo, I would like to see them beat the Chiefs potentially in the championship game if it gets to that point. So I think regardless of who we pick, we're both on the same side that we want this team to beat the Chiefs. So we'll see. But that's going to do it for this week's Mushing Hour, Johnson. We have just 2 more Mushing Hours left in this NFL season. We have the championship week next week, and of course, the Super Bowl. So our NFL season is coming down to the end. It's been a thrilling NFL season, and we are one step closer to finding out who will be this year's Super Bowl champion. Any final thoughts before we wrap this one up?
Go Mike Vrabel, go Patriots. I don't know.
Oh, right.
I hope I.
Right. I forgot to mention that.
I hope
Congratulations to you. What initial thoughts about that before we, I never got to ask you about that. What do you think about it?
he's the coach. He's the coach I wanted last year, so I'm
Yeah.
okay with it.
Yeah, I think that was the most obvious hire that was going to happen. I don't think anyone was really surprised that Vrabel got the job. I'm curious to see what this brings for New England. I think if you're, Drake May and company, you got a potential bright future, and now you got to see what you do with this new coach, a guy that's familiar with the organization. So at least happy for you that you got your guy. Let's see what they do in the offseason now in terms of free agency and the draft. So only time's gonna tell for New England. Yeah, we definitely will see. But Johnson, that's gonna do it for this week's edition of the All Gas No Break Sports Show as we now head into the divisional round of this year's NFL postseason. Some thrilling matchups are coming this weekend. We have the Texans going into Kansas City to take on the Chiefs. Commanders going on the road to take on the Detroit Lions. The Rams and the Eagles and the Ravens and the Bills should be some fun and exciting action. This has been Nicholas Pavona, joined alongside by my co-host Andrew Johnson for the All Gas No Break Sports Show. Have a great rest of your weekend. Enjoy your NFL Divisional Round playoff matchups, and we'll see you next week for Conference Championship Preview.